Hey, what's up, everyone? Today we're going to go through some of the techniques that I use to propagate these cotoneasters. And there are so many different ways to propagate trees, and particularly things that are easy to root like cotoneaster, that it can get really confusing. And so I'm just going to go through and give you a few examples in this video. It can seem like there's a lot to propagating, so many variables that you have to take into account, and people get to wondering, at least I get to wondering about, well, should I do this or should I do that? So, among the variables that you have to take into account are the time of year, the rooting hormone that you're using, the rooting media that you're sticking the cuttings into, the health of the parent plant, the size of the cutting, whether or not the parent plant has any diseases, and are you going to use bottom heat? Are you going to mist the cuttings to prevent them from drying out? So all of these things lead to just a bewildering prospect, I think, in my mind. And so you can just kind of move past all that and try one technique first. Use whatever you have available, and don't let it stop you if it doesn't succeed. So the first time that I took cuttings was with junipers, and I did the cuttings, and I just stuck them with no rooting hormone into some bonsai soil, and I stuck them right out in the sun, and they all fried. But you know, there's a lot of different ways to do things, and so let me just give you one concrete example here. So these are Cotoneaster microphyllus, and I propagated all of them from one parent plant. It's sort of been a snowballing kind of thing to the point where I actually now have quite a few of them. So in my first example here, I have a plant that's not super healthy, and what's going on here is that there's some scale on this twig, and there's a little bit on this healthier twig, but not as much. So I'm not going to use this plant as a parent plant because I don't want to put that scale into the pot with all of the cuttings that I'm doing. So anything that has scale on it is going to be less likely to root, or it's just going to grow more slowly after it does root if it does succeed. And so inspect the plants that you have, and look for ones that are growing well, healthy, appear to be disease and pest free prior to starting to create cuttings from those plants. So I'm going to set this one aside and go to this one. Now, these are obviously cuttings from a previous batch that I wired, and now they've kind of grown out. This one's actually been cut back here once before, but there's a couple of roots here I could trim off. When I'm doing this for my own purposes, I'm not just making cuttings. What I'm actually doing is I'm trimming back the prior year's trees or prior round of trees that I created to further them, and at the same time using the leftover cut off material to create additional trees. Now, this one has some great movement in it, but I don't think I want all of that movement because I tend to want to make small trees. So I'm actually going to cut off the top half of this, which gives me a piece that has movement in it already to try to root. I'll set that aside and set this aside and grab a couple more. So there's some small shoots. I'll cut off some of those. And then this larger shoot at the top. Let me just kind of check. I'm going to cut that back to get this started in terms of it being a small tree. All right. Now, I have a terracotta pot here that I'm going to put the cuttings into. The soil that's in here is actually just a mixture of a bunch of different stuff. There's cocoa coir and perlite. That's my main rooting media that I use. But this I just grabbed this out of a tub that I had in my garage, and there's a little bit of bonsai soil mixed in with it as well. Perlite's a little bit of a strange animal. The bigger pieces actually hold more water because they have more porosity within the particle than the smaller pieces, sort of like popcorn. And it's a really good media for keeping things evenly wet. It kind of dries down slowly, or more evenly than something just like sand. And coco coir is reasonably easy to get your hands on and is a good substitute. Rather than using peat moss, you can use sand and peat moss. You can just use regular potting mix. The medium that you use will affect the health of the cuttings as well as the rate of success, but use whatever you have to start and then branch out from there. Don't spend a ton of money going out and getting some specific media just so that you can take a few cuttings, because your cuttings, as a bonsai practitioner, should kind of be a side thing. So unless you're actually planning on starting a nursery, you don't need to be super good at taking cuttings. So in terms of the actual cuttings, this guy's really small. It's a very small twig, and all I have to do basically is strip the leaves off there, and then I can stick it in here. But the other thing that I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to use some rooting hormone. This is a Hormex powder number 3. Most rooting hormones are pretty much the same thing. You don't really have to think about, like, they have different, so there's Clonex, which is a gel. There's a bunch of liquids. I tend to like the powders. Not really sure why. The Clonex gel works perfectly fine. The concentration of the active ingredient is what makes this a number 3. So for something like a Cotoneaster that's relatively easy to root, that's a lower concentration of the hormone, of the rooting hormone, in this powder than it is in, say, like a number 8, which I would use typically for junipers and other things that are a little bit harder to root from cutting. And I think there's also actually a number 16 for things that are very difficult. So I'm cutting these into, in this case, about 3-inch long pieces. They can actually be bigger than this. They don't have to be just 3 inches, and the twig doesn't have to be this small. And I'm just removing a few of the leaves, any leaf that would end up under the soil as I'm sticking it in, and I'm sticking it into the soil about 1 inch, so that it has some space along the stem to throw out roots. Now, in my experience, these Cotoneasters will root all along that stem. They don't generally form a large callus and root from that. They will pretty much just root from anything. So with this bigger piece here that I cut off, I would remove this, the little side shoots here, and take the crooked piece and cut it into its own cutting, so that if this does root, that it'll start growing and end up basically being a usable, or it'll more quickly become a bonsai because of the jump start it has. But in my experience, these cuttings are much less successful than just straight littler branches when it comes to Cotoneaster. So if you have interesting pieces like this, I would actually recommend that you use an air layering technique or a ground layering technique, and I'll get back to that in a minute. Now I'm going to go ahead and chop this up into pieces and put all of them in here. All right, so that's half a pot full of cuttings, and that brings me to the point where I would be talking about the aftercare. So as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, in my first attempt to do cuttings many years ago, I just stuck them back out in the sun. Well, as you can imagine, having no roots, they don't do very well stuck out in the sun, especially junipers. The Cotoneasters, and generally with cuttings, it's not universally true, but generally with cuttings, putting them in a very low light situation and then making sure that the humidity stays as high as possible are two of the key things. So if you can provide some sort of regular misting system, either whether that's timed or triggered by the ambient moisture or something like that, that will help you. And if you can keep them in a dark place, that will help you as well. What's up? I mentioned ground layering or air layering. So let's just talk about ground layering first. When I propagate these, they will kind of initially send up shoots and then they kind of start going sideways. And if they get into a little bit more shade, the shoots are a little bit more flexible. And so in some cases, what I've had actually happen is that a branch from this pot will actually just end up in contact with the soil like that in another pot. And it will just, without any coaxing whatsoever, send out roots. So if you want to propagate these and you're having trouble with the cuttings, or you can't keep them out of full sun for whatever reason, then you can literally just stick a container next to the container that you have your parent plant in and kind of bury part of the stem. And then what'll happen usually within a few weeks is you'll get some roots coming out of there, and you can just go ahead and cut it on the original root side, and it will take over growing from those roots. Keep an eye on what the base looks like in this sort of a scenario, because it can end up looking a little bit funky, but it's an easy way to propagate these guys. That also works with a lot of other species, but not all species. I've actually done it with junipers as well. So air layering or ground layering them is definitely an option. Now, if you have a really, like if you're thinking to yourself you're gonna go invade your neighbor's yard and they have like a giant old Cotoneaster and you're gonna cut off, like a big 2-inch chunk and root it, that is a little bit more difficult with these guys. So I would recommend that you actually try an air layer in that case, because they will root readily. I would just do an air layer if you can, and that will pretty much guarantee success. With a large piece, like something, say, that was the size of my thumb, what seems to happen is that they either don't take as readily, or they will root at the junction of a side branch and the roots will actually come off the smaller twig. And that gives you sort of a very odd looking formation in terms of trying to create a good looking bonsai from it. All right, thanks everyone. I hope that helped you with your Cotoneaster propagation, and we'll see you in the next video.